I'm going to do this a little bit differently than the lecture yesterday, in that yesterday I mentioned the W3 schools tutorial, and yesterday we kind of went over this stuff. The home, the intro, the getting started, the syntax, the selectors, and the events. I'm not going to go over any of those. We did that yesterday. All right? But today, the stuff that's in there today is more or less on this. Chapter 9 is on this. And some of the stuff that's in here on traversing and HTML and Ajax, etc. The Ajax, that's going to be chapter 12, and this is going to be later chapters. All right? But what I want to concentrate on right now is talking about the effects. Now, most of the effects that are in here, as soon as you hear what they are, you'll have a pretty good idea of how they're used, what they are, etc. All right? So we just take it from the top here. I'm not going to run through every example. That would be silly to do that. But you'll notice at first there's a hide and show. All right? And they're opposites of one another. Does that make sense? You can set it up for a click event. So if you want something to disappear, you can make it hide. If you want something to reappear, you can make it show. Now think about this in terms of, when we, the programs that we've done. Think about it for even the crypto test. All right? You can make those error messages hide and show. When we looked at the other one that we did with that gold background that we kind of went through as a pre-test as a class, you can make any or all of those messages hide and show, as an example. You can make anything hide and show. Now, quite often when you do it, it's like it is right here. You associate it with a click event. All right? You don't have to do that, but that's pretty popular to do it that way. So what they do here is they show you examples. Again, it's not going to pay to run through the examples because if I click it, it's just going to hide. All right? But if you want to know how to use it, it's shown right here. I would strongly suggest that for your test next week, you might even want to keep this page open. All right? As you're going through to take a look at things. But again, as always, that's your call. So that's hide and show. Fade, same kind of thing. But as you probably guess, you can fade something in, you can fade something out, and you can work on a toggle with it. Almost all of these properties that these methods that we work with have a toggle, which means if it's not present, make it present. If it is present, hide it. One thing about this, and I should go back to this just so you see this, but if I grab one of these, I do want you to realize that when you do hide something, notice what happens. It literally, it's gone. Okay? It's not like it's invisible, but it's still there. It's literally gone. So hopefully you saw how what happened was those buttons, when they went up. All right? You don't have to do that. And there's other ways you can do it. So again, pretty simple. Hide it, show it. And oftentimes, as mentioned right there, it's connected to a button. All right? Because buttons are pretty popular for having a click event. All right. The fade, again, similar types of things. Notice that when you fade, you can fade in, you can fade out, you can fade toggle, and there's even a fade to. I don't want to run through all of them because most of them probably make at least pretty much sense to you. All right, but if on your next test, hint, hint, you're asked to do something like this. So you're asked to make something fade in, or you're asked to make it fade out. You should know how to do it. We will start talking about that today because, again, that's pretty much the concepts that are explained in this chapter. All right? All right. There's a slide. And in a way, let's just take a look at one of them. We'll look at the slide down. Does that make sense? Hopefully you notice also there's a slide down, there's a slide up, and there's a slide toggle. This would be another one that you could use, for example, for an FAQ page. So there's a lot of different ways that this stuff can be used. And the main idea, the main takeaway from this is, again, not much code. There's much more code in setting up the HTML to handle it. All right, and the only other thing I would say about this one is, again, there's a slide toggle, and it's what you think it would be. So again, hopefully you see how that could be used with something like an FAQ page. All right, and if you did that, you could still use the plus and minus, but you wouldn't necessarily even have to use the plus and minus. But what you might want to do then is, if you're not going to use the plus and minus, is to use some code like this. Now, this isn't the greatest of examples, because if this was FAQ, you probably really wouldn't want it to say click the slide. You know, you'd want it to be some fact. But you could say above it, you could put an H1 tag that says click on any of these. But hopefully, too, you realize, and we'll talk about it today, that you can set up an FAQ page. I mean, if we had, let's say we had 3 of these, we could set it up so all 3 could be open. But typically, you don't make it so like 2 are open, but usually you set it up so either you can have all of them open, or only one of them open, or none open. That's the most popular way of doing it. Why? Because you don't know what somebody wants to do. So if you have 3 of these, it's much easier to go through than if you have one open all the time. You can also default one so that it's open when you start. And if you do that, most often, you put these things in some kind of an order that makes sense. And also normally, but you don't have to, if you're going to have one open, it's the first one. You don't have to do that. But it's just kind of, practice that's what people do. All right. Then there's animate. I mean, this is the first time we're actually doing something. And let's face it, the animates that they show in here are really, really simplistic. What do I mean? That's easiest to show you. Okay? And that was kind of herky-jerky. But you can make it, in this case, they're moving it to the right. Think about this. You could move it to the right, then you could move it down, then you could move it to the left, then you could move it up to make it go in a square-like pattern, for example. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do this kind of stuff. All right. And again, what you'll notice when you look at that, okay, there's animates, and you tell it what you want it to do. You want it to go, animate left, and how many pixels you want it to animate, etc. All right. There's a stop command. All right. The thing that's funky about this is, and I've seen this before, maybe you have, you go out to a website and they have a lot of animations, and they might even have several running at once. And after a while it gets, you're kind of like this type of thing. All right. So quite often, if you want to start a new animation and one is running, you might call stop to make the one that's currently running just stop running. All right. This right here, if you read nothing else this semester, if you read nothing else from your book, if you read nothing else that I've told you, right here, this is the subject of the class that you'll take next fall. And that's a callback function. All right? Back in the olden days, like when I was your age, and after I moved out of the house, let's say that I was going, and I was going out and I was going to go visit some friends in another state. All right? My mom would say something like, when you get home, give me a call. All right, that type of thing. Well, the reason I'm telling you that, it's sort of like a callback. With a callback, you do something. Whatever the something is, once it's completed, you call the callback. That's what a callback means. Now, what we'll talk about next semester, there's really, not next semester, I'm sorry, in fall, there's really 3 ways of doing these callbacks. And over time, they've gotten easier to do. Callbacks by themselves can lead to a lot of nested code where you've got this callback and this callback and this callback and this callback. And literally, you may or may not care, but it's literally called callback hell. In fact, there is a website that's called callbackhell.com. And it's not dirty, but it shows you how you can have something within something within something, and how it can get very hard for people to understand. All right? So what they did was they came up with a way, as JavaScript got more and more mature, to make this a little bit easier to use. And they came up with something that was called promises. Now, as an example, let's say that I promise all of you I'll be here tomorrow morning. Okay, so I'm making you a promise. If you come in here tomorrow morning and I'm here in programming talk, that means that promise was resolved. In other words, it happened. But let's say that I wake up tomorrow morning and I have a fever. and I'm like, well, I'm following the Rankin guidelines, I don't commit. Okay? Then that promise was rejected. That's the terminology that you use. When you create a promise, which is another, basically it's a refined type of callback, it either happens, which means the promise was resolved, or it doesn't happen, which means the promise was rejected. All right? And then there's a third way of doing it, and it's something that's called async and await. Now, you can go and look this stuff up and find it out. I'm just mentioning it to you. But it all goes back in the end to being able to understand these callbacks. That's why I'm saying it. And I don't think you're going to read this, not the callback hell thing, but I don't think that most of you're probably going to read this and it's going to, oh, that totally makes sense. No. But at least, I'm always of the mindset that it's easier to relearn something than it is to learn something. So if you've got at least some kind of an idea of what it's about, it may help you. There's also a pretty darn good chance that at the end of next semester, other than Angie, but for everybody else, and you're welcome to come in on that day, all right, at the end of the semester, I'll probably give a lecture on what this stuff is all about. Just one lecture. We do have, as of right now, we have 2 more people joining in spring. That they're not in this class, but they'll be in the C# class. All right. Okay. And then finally, we've got chaining. And I actually mentioned this to you yesterday. You may or may not have heard me, listened, or whatever. But what does this mean? This means that anything that's got an ID of P1, first we want to add it and make it red. Then we want to slide it up, all right, over 2 seconds. 2,000 means 2,000 milliseconds, which is 2 seconds. And then we want it to slide down over 2 seconds. But the point is, we want it to do the first one, then the second one, then the third one, then the fourth one, etc. When you put a bunch of these different methods together, it's period method name, etc., period method name, etc. That's called chaining. So again, you'll see this if you look here, and it's not all that cool, but hopefully you saw that. It came down, it went up. All right? And it is, like I said, it's chaining. All right? Now, it's already added the stuff. It's added the red, but it'll slide up. All right? And then it slides down. The big thing, and I've said this before, you may have all heard me say this already, is, yeah, animation's it's a good thing. You can do some really cool stuff with it. And I'm asking you this question. This is a rhetorical question. Please don't answer. All right? When you do your electronic portfolio, when we work on it as a class, should we put animation in it? There's no right answer. But never let the animation overshadow the message. So in other words, you might have this really cool animation, and nobody remembers you, but they remember the animation. Believe me, they're not going to remember because Jameer did it. Oh, that must be Jameer. He must be really, really good at this. No. They're going to, hey, remember that guy who had that really cool animation? Because that's how it works. All right? But with some sites, I mean, let's face it, if you were going to do a gaming site, you might want to put some animation in there, or almost like clips of games or whatever. If you're doing a site that's basically like the AARP site, the American Association of Retired People, probably wouldn't use a lot of animation because old people like to read text. They still read books. All right? They don't open up a book and say, how many pictures are in here, so that's less that I have to read. All right? So, like I said, that was just meant to be a very, very simple. So I would strongly suggest that when you're studying for the test that you're going to take, and I believe, double check, that test, so we're right here, this is where we are today. Tomorrow will be the pretest, it'll be a lab. We've already talked about that, we'll talk about it more at the end of the period. But next Monday, it's 8 and 9. All right? And it's hands-on, it's the whole period. But I would strongly suggest that you look at this section in here for Chapter 8, and this section in here for Chapter 9. That doesn't mean there might not be something in here or in here, etc., that you could use. Notice there's examples here. So you might want to look at the examples. And if you say, I don't have time, then don't do it. Part of my job is to make you as equipped as possible so when you come in here to take a test, you're as ready as you can be. Now, there's other resources. There's plenty of other things out there. What I like about W3 Schools is it's one of the more intuitive websites. Most of the examples are simplistic. And why is that important? Because as you're learning it, it's better to have simple examples, in my opinion. All right, enough. So let's go on into chapter 9. Not a real long chapter. How to use effects and animation. All right. It says many developers like these methods the best because they're fun to develop and they add interest to a page. It's even more than that. They add glitz to a page. They can take a website that's pretty boring and spice it up. I mean, let's face it, it doesn't matter what it is, especially though if you're trying to sell something. Whatever that something is, you want to get people to your site, and once you get there, you want to get them coming back to your site. All right, and this is one of the ways that you can do that. All right. Now it says, keep in mind that it may be difficult to understand how some of these work until you see them in action. That's why, again, with the W3 School site, you can modify their code right on screen. You change the amount of time, etc., change the color, change the direction, change whatever, and see what happens. That's the best way to learn. All right. All right. It says we've included most of the examples in this chapter in the downloadable, so you have that stuff. All right. So what do we have here? The methods for effects. Then they redo the fax application with effects. There's the slideshow with effects. And then they get into animation. Finally, the chapter ends with a carousel. Do you all understand what a carousel is? I don't want to take anything for granted, but you should, for your test, know how to build a carousel using JavaScript. All right? Okay, so as it says, the figure that we'll look at in a minute summarizes the jQuery methods for effects, including two that we talked about in the last chapter, show and hide. All right. Now notice it says for all of the methods except fade to, the primary parameter is duration. How long do you want something to animate? This is the kind of thing that, again, and I don't think I think you all get what I'm going to say. If your audience is younger, you can animate faster. If your audience is older, you want to animate slower. That should just make sense to you. So who is your target audience? Now, is it possible that an 80-year-old man or woman might go out to a gaming site to take a look at what's out there? Of course it is. But that's probably not your primary audience. Okay? All right. The fade to method, which we'll look at in a minute, not only requires a duration parameter, but what's called an opacity parameter. You know what opacity is. Remember that if something is 1, it's totally opaque. You can totally see it. If it's 0, it's totally transparent. So if you're fading to something, let's think about it. What could you use that as? Well, we talked before about a rollover where you maybe would have a before and after picture of somebody like a Nutrisystem. You could also use a fade to, couldn't you? And if you had it fade really slowly, you could kind of show how they got thinner and thinner and thinner, or whatever. All right? I'm reading this thing online from this guy. His name is Drew Manning. And he's written this book that's called Fit the Fat to Fit. And the guy's in phenomenal shape. But what he did was he purposely went out and gained 60 pounds. And basically it was just about all fat on purpose. So he could lose it and talk about his journey. Well, now I think that he's doing it again, but he's over 40 because he's trying to show how much harder it is as you get older. The point is, that'd be something you could use a fade to on if you wanted to. All right? So let's take a look at a couple of the examples. So these are the basic methods. Again, not an exhaustive list. These are the kind of things, again, two things, two other sites, jQuery.com, and go to the API documentation, and jQueryUI.com has got some of these. All right? All right. So I'm not going to read them. We've looked at a couple of these already. Ideally, with virtually all of these, you know, when you look at the word, you can figure out what's happening. Some people with slide up and slide down, they refer to it as being either an accordion or a shade. You know, like you pull a shade down, you pull a shade back up type of an idea. So as always, notice that for each one of these, except the fade 2, except the last ones, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9 out of 10, this is all you need. All right, the duration means how long do you want it to happen? The callback means is once that duration is completed, what do you want to have happen? So you might have something go like this for 10 seconds. And then after 10 seconds, you might either have it disappear or you might have it stay still, as an example. So that would be what you would do in the callback. All right. And you'll notice maybe you don't want anything to happen. So what happens here? You get this startup message. It comes in, and after 5 seconds, it fades out. All right? And typically when it fades out like that, it'll fade out fairly quickly. But there's different ways that you can do that. And again, you could have it do a fade 2 and have it fade from one thing to another thing, type of an idea. You can chain with this stuff. All right? Here is an example with a callback. Now notice what it says. This right here, this gets the same result that this does. Good, bad, or indifferent, there's almost always several different ways of writing the same thing when you're doing this. That's, again, why I recommend a site like W3 Schools, because as you're learning, you should write it in a way that makes sense to you. And if you say, hey, you know, there's too many periods in here, I'm kind of confused, then don't use that if you can help it. Do it more like this. It might be a little bit more work. Do it the way that it makes you understand the best. Now, if you don't want to use numbers, you can use slow and you can use fast. Notice as it says, by default, all right, the duration is 400 milliseconds for slow, 600 milliseconds for, I'm sorry, the default is 400. Slow is 600, fast is 200. What does that mean? That means a lot less than a second. So for fast, we're talking about a fifth of a second. You kind of have to watch it or you miss it. That's the other thing with animation. You might be really cool, but if it happens right when the site loads, people might not have ever even seen that it happens. All right. So as it says here, the callback parameter is for a function that is called after the effect is finished. It's what I mentioned. If more than one element is selected, the callback function is run once for each element. All right. Chaining is commonly used again with these effects. So as we look at this, the next thing they're going to do in here is the FAQ application, as it says, with jQuery effects. Again, I'm not going to lie to you. Know this for the test. All right? You have the stuff from the book. You have this code. I resent you all the code yesterday for chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, the remaining chapters that we'll cover this semester. Plus, you had it already. It was in the GitHub repository. All right, all the book app stuff. You were given that earlier. And what's the difference? Not really a whole heck of a lot in here. All right. Now, what are they doing, though? Well, does it make sense in here? Can you look at this and say, oh, look, we've got this big heading. If you wanted to, I'm not saying you have to do this, but I'm asking you this question. Would it be possible then that you could take this code right here and use a special effect on it? You could take the one that's highlighted and make that heading bigger or make it a different color to show which one is active. All right. Those are just ideas, not that you have to do that. And again, the idea here is pretty much it's the simplicity in what's doing it here. Here they're doing it with a slide down and a fade out. Here they're doing it with a slide toggle. So they're saying the slide toggle will do the same thing as a fade out then a slide down. As I mentioned, there's always a multiple number of ways of doing the same thing. And it's not even that one is preferable. Again, for you right now, I know I keep harping on the same things, but make it understandable to you. All right? And, you know, the first time you start creating animations, are they going to look fantastic? Probably not. Just in the same way I would think that if you go back in May of 2022 and you look at some of the first JavaScript code you wrote in September or October of 2020, you're going to go, wow, I didn't really write that very well. Well, it's just the natural process, all right? So then they come in here with a slideshow where they put some effects in here, all right? And you got a lot of different ways that you can do this. Now notice they're talking about a fade out and a fade in. When you do that, you don't even need to have, a chevron over here and over here to allow you to go forward and backwards, or like the dashes like they put in Bootstrap. You just have to set the time. The problem with doing it that way is, again, depending on the site, if it's a site for young people and you have a change, let's say every 3 seconds, because that's just a really good time you think. To young people, 3 seconds is an eternity. They want a way that they're able to go to the next one and the next one, and especially if there's a lot of pictures. All right. So you'll notice in here, what do we have? Well, we've got IDs. Why? Well, that means that we're going to play with those things in jQuery, right? And there's our CSS, and then on the next page, I think, they show you 2 different ways to code the jQuery. There's one, and there's one. And again, it's not a question of which way is better. It's a question of which one makes more sense to you. As you'd probably guess, the more complex your animation and your special effects are, the more code you're going to have to write. All right. So I would not recommend, that if you're doing a pre-test or you're doing your test and you're asked to do some animation, that you make it look like the 4th of July when you've got the grand finale for the fireworks. No, it's probably going to be a lot more work. So when we look in here, what do we have? Well, this right here, this is creating a new array right there to hold our images. All right. This each that you use here in jQuery, it's like a for loop. So it's telling us to go through and basically grab the source for each image and grab the alt for each image and then cache them. And the reason they're caching them is, again, so they're available as soon as the program begins to run. All right. And then they start the slideshow. So what are they doing? Well, notice they've got a thing in here that says set interval. Remember what set interval means? I said it's like having an alarm clock with a snooze button on it. But the way we're using it here is we're telling it to fade out after a second. And notice we're having the caption fade out after a second, then the slide fade out after a second. And then you're going through here, and basically what we're doing is we're saying after that happens, have the next slide fade in. So what do you have to worry about, so to speak, there? Let's say we have 4 slides. All right? And you put in slide 1, fades out, number 2 fades in. Number 2 fades out, number 3 fades in. Number 3 fades out, number 4 fades in. Right? Now you've gone through the whole progression. Well, typically what you want to have happen then is number 4 to fade out, number 1 to come back again. And that's what they're addressing in here. Okay? Just basically so that it loops. So they do it in here, and again, then they do it in here. Which way is better? You take a look at it and you say, which one makes more sense to me? All right? It's possible that you may write some of the code for your next test where you're taking stuff from the book here or from W3 Schools or whatever, and yeah, it kind of makes sense, but it doesn't totally make sense to me. All right? In the afternoon class, when I'm talking with my student in there, Keegan, we've been doing, in the last 2 weeks, we've done about 4 projects. And they've all been different, yet they've all been the same. And he's finally saying, I'm starting to get kind of a comfort level with this stuff. That, yeah, I can see that there's a lot of similarities, and just by doing it, that's how you get better with anything. All right? So, how to stop and start a slideshow. As it says, to improve the usability, you usually provide some way to stop and to restart it. Okay? Why is that even a big thing? Sometimes people really want to check out a certain image. All right, maybe that's happened to you, maybe it hasn't, but let's just assume for a second that you're thinking of taking a vacation, hopefully after next summer, after all this stuff ends. All right? And you decide that you want to go to, I don't know, North Carolina. So you go onto a site and they have in there, you want to go, I think it's Hilton Head, I don't know if it's North or South Carolina, but you decide you want to go there. So you go out to a website and they've got a slideshow and you go to a certain slide and you want to be able to stop and really look at it because you're thinking, yeah, that's maybe where I'd like to stay or whatever. Well, the more opportunity you give people to do things like that, the more they're going to want to use your site. All right. But if you're going to do that, you might even want to put a message near the top of the slideshow that says, if you want to pause it at any time, just click on a slide and then click on it again to restart. All right. Now, a lot of people, especially younger people, they'll figure that out. All right. A lot of people, like my 90-year-old mother, I think I could sit there and show it to her, and 5 minutes later, she'd probably forget it. But that's all I can do. So as it says, it shows you the jQuery there for both stopping and for restarting a slideshow. Are you going to be expected to do that on your test? I don't remember. But I don't think there's a start and stop. There could be. I don't really remember. All right. So as it says, with this code, the user can stop a slideshow by clicking on a slide and restart it by clicking on the slide again. So the code for the slideshow doesn't have to be reopened, or repeated, I'm sorry. It is coded in a function expression. In other words, isn't that why we make functions, period? Because if we want to call the same code over and over and over again, we want to write it once. That way, if there's a problem, we only have to fix it in one place. All right. Plus, it's reusable. All right. Because the run slideshow is run as a function expression, it must come before the set interval that calls it. Otherwise, the JavaScript engine will throw an error. So if I'm going to say call this code that's up here, depending, and you're using something like set interval, you must put the code up here that's going to be called, and the code that calls it's got to be below. In other words, you can't put the code that calls it and then put the actual called code below that. All right? Sometimes with some different languages, they allow you to put code anywhere, and sometimes with some different languages, they're really picky. JavaScript is actually pretty liberal, but there are occasions, depending on what you're writing, that you have to do things in a certain way. All right, that gets us then into animation. All right, and I love that. Now that you know how to use the basic jQuery effects, now I would change that to now that you've been exposed to the basic jQuery effects. It says you'll learn how to use what the jQuery website refers to as custom effects, and one of those again is animation. All right, so as it says right there, here the first parameter is a properties map that's coded in braces. This map consists of name-value pairs, and it almost looks like, and we'll talk about this in Chapter 12, what's known as JSON, JavaScript Object Notation. All right? So if I was going to create a person, I would have things like first name, Gabriel, last name, Williams, gender, M, height, etc., weight, etc. Does that all make sense? All right. And they're saying that it's similar here. It's not identical. All right. But hopefully it's something that you can look at and that it makes some sense. The example they give here is dorky. They're just sliding that across the screen. Most animations, I guess I really can't say that. Many animations are not done with text. Because let's face it, making the text jump back and forth all over the screen might be more irritating to people than it might be welcome. But again, it depends. It depends on what that text is. So if you decided that you're going to have a real big H1 at the top of your portfolio, you're going to have it fade in and come in from across the screen and say, hi, my name is Angie Shelton, something like that. That might be fine. You probably wouldn't want it where it was doing like that, with hi, my name is Angie Shelton, and it was going up and down like that. All right? But for some sites, that might make a whole heck of a lot of sense. So notice they're setting up what they want to have happen in here. They're setting it up inside of the CSS. Now, I may have told you this, I may not have before, and if I didn't, I'm sorry for not having told it to you. But when you set things like margin, when you set things like padding, etc., you can give them negative values. And the reason that that's important is you literally could set it up so that at the beginning of your site, something was off the page. And it eventually made its way onto the page by either going left to right, right to left, down, up to down, or down to up. Now, if you're going to do that, most often you go from left to right, because that's how people are used to seeing things. We don't live in a country where we read from right to left like they do in some other countries. There it may make more sense to do it that way. In the same way, usually if you animate, you're going to animate from up to down, not from down to up. But, you know, there's always exceptions to everything. So when you look at this, what are we doing here? All right, we're telling it to animate. The font size is 275%. What does that mean? Probably whatever the font size was, we're making it 2 3/4 times the size that it was. That makes sense? All right. The opacity, we want it to show totally. All right. Have you ever noticed when you do a margin left, it pushes what you have to the right? And when you do a margin right, it pushes it to the left? Well, here they're saying left plus equal 175. So it's going to take what you had and it's going to push it to the right. Does that make sense? All right. And then when you're all done, you're going to run this. Okay. Again, the easiest way to figure out how this stuff is used and what you do with it is to run these examples yourselves. All right. I wanted to take no more than about an hour or so this morning to go over this. I mean, I can bring up every one of these examples and we can run them. And you'll see text jump back and forth and they have different colors, etc. I think it'll make more sense and you can do it at your own pace by doing it yourselves. All right. As it says, when the animate property is run, the CSS properties for the selected elements are changed to the properties in the property map that's coded as the first parameter of the method. That's what's in here, or in here. The animation is done in a phase transition based on the duration parameter. So how fast do you want it to happen rather. Remember, if you make it happen too fast, people aren't even going to see that it happened. You could have really neat animation, but if it happens so fast, you know, it's just like, you know, the old joke about, you know, or not joke, but like a rabbit ran. Did you see that rabbit run across the road? No, I didn't. Okay. To specify a property name in the properties map, as it says, you use camel casing instead of hyphenation. This is an important concept. So for instance, if you're doing something like that, let's just say, you know that when you do background color, you can either type in background, or you can type in background minus color. Would you all agree with that? You can do it either way. If you're doing that with animation, you're going to get an error. It's going to think that those are two variables, one called background, and it's going to try to subtract color from it. So if you're going to do that, you have to write it like this. That's the camel casing that they're talking about. Why? It's just the way that it's set up. All right? Because I've had people say to me, well, why'd they do that? I don't know. I didn't do it. But I don't know why somebody else, they decided to do it that way. All right. To specify anything non-numeric, put it in quotes. You'll oftentimes see it in double quotes, but it can be single. To specify a numeric property, as it says, just code the values. You can use plus equal and minus equal. All right? But these expressions must be enclosed in quotes. Well, what does that mean? It's shown right here. All right? And really, plus equals and minus equals are the ones that make the most sense. If you're going to try to use times equal and divide equal, you're going to be changing it by so much, it's going to be too radical of an effect. All right. For some properties like width, height, and opacity, you can use show, hide, and toggle. We've already talked about those. Although color transitions aren't handled properly by jQuery, they are by jQuery UI. So I've already shown you that, the jQueryui.com website. Chaining animation methods, we've already talked about chaining. All right. And there's different ways that you can do this. Now, they talk in here about things being queued. And I think you all understand what a queue is. We don't have a bookstore here, but let's assume that it's next fall, and hopefully we're not wearing masks, and hopefully I can give you a break, and everybody takes a break at the same time, and you all go down to the lounge. Well, there'll be a big line there, right? Let's assume we only had one machine that had food, so you're all in line. That's a queue, right? The first one that's in there is the first one that's out of there. And unfortunately, the last one that's in there is the last one that's out of there. All right? Well, the reason I'm telling you that is when it queues up animations, it does it in the same way. It's like it's putting them in a line. And the first in line is the first that's going to be served. The second in line is the second that's going to be served, etc. All right? And that's what they're talking about here. And remember, you can also set up callback functions. All right, this is pretty radical stuff from what we've talked about, but it's the basis. You have to understand this. The way that JavaScript works by default is it works synchronously. So in other words, and you know this, if I were to sit there and write a program, and I were to have 5 alert boxes, so I said alert, this is message 1, alert, this is message 2, and I did it 5 times. You with me? All right, it would print the first alert, this is message 1, then the second alert, this is message 2, all the way through the 5th one. You all agree with that? That's synchronous. It means it does it one at a time. But if I were to come in there and say, show me a message box where this is message 1, show me another one that this is message 2, but then I would set one of those timeouts that we talked about, and I said, wait 3 seconds, and then show this is message 3, and then outside of that, show this is message 4, show this is message 5. Then you're telling it to run what's known as asynchronously. Because what's going to happen is it's going to show the message box for message 1, it's going to show the message box for message 2, it's going to skip the message 3 for 3 seconds, it's going to do the message box for 4, the message box for 5, because it's queued up, and it's basically said, wait 3 seconds, and then show me the one for message 3. And that's basically what we're talking about here. All right. So as it says, when you chain the effects and animations for an element, they are placed in a queue. And they run in sequence. They don't run at this. I mean, imagine if they did run at the same time. All right. It would be so herky-jerky that it would be really hard to see any type of animation. All right. When separate effects and animations are started for an element, they're also placed in a queue and run in sequence. When you use a callback, it's run after the entire animation has completed. That's why you need to give it a duration. All right. In some cases, a problem will occur if the user starts a second animation for an element before the callback for the first animation is finished. That's that stop method that we talked about before. All right. And what could happen? Well, imagine you had 2 boxes on the screen, and one of them you were making go left and right, left and right, left and right, right and left, etc. And then you had another one that you wanted to go up and down. Even if they hit into one another, they're boxes. You won't know it anyway. But if the first one's happening, you might want it to happen for 5 seconds. Then you don't really want to start the second one until the first one's over. And if for some reason it is still running, you might want to run the stop method to stop it before the next one starts. All right, and speaking of which, how to use delay, stop, and finish methods. If we look at these, delay the start of the next animation in the queue. You're telling it to stop for a certain amount of time. All right. Maybe what it is you've got really cool animations and you want to wait for 2 or 3 seconds afterwards so people can, not to be funny, but drink in what they just did or have seen, rather than doing this and then all of a sudden doing this and then going back to this, etc. You might want to put a gap in there. All right. Stop, as we said, to stop the current animation. All right. And finish, as it says, stop the current animation, clear the queue, and complete everything else that's in there. So when you look at this, you're going to be expected to be able to do something like this, not the one that's shown there. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. All right. So I'm not going to read this to you, but you can take a quick look at it. It's pretty much what I just said to you. All right. Now, the last thing, I think this is about the last thing that's discussed in the chapter, but they talk about easing. And with easing, the key thing with easing is how do you want an effect to take place? I don't know if that even makes sense to you. Do you want it to ease in and ease out? Do you want it to ease up or down, etc.? So there's a lot of different easing methods that you can use. All right. It says jQuery really provides only two easings, linear and swing, but they work at a different rate. In other words, let's say that you've got something that's done linear. That means that if it's animating across the screen, it's going to go like this, and it's going to always be the same speed. With more of a swing, it might start fast, slow down, and end fast, or however you want it set up. All right, so it's how you want the effect to be seen. It says if you want to use other easings, you can use a plugin, which we're going to talk about in a later chapter, like the jQuery easing plugin that they show here. All right. So notice ease out, bounce, ease in, bounce. Literally, it does that. In fact, just so you see this, and I don't want to waste your time, but I think over here, there it is, easing. All right. And this is such a cool example because you can click on any of these and it shows you. There's linear, it's happening at the same speed. There's swing. You may or may not have noticed, but it started slow and it got faster. All right, and there's the default. I guess I don't even know what it's doing. But the point is, why do we care? Because again, you can always come down here. So if you are asked to do something like this, be it on this test or the next test, you know where you can go. And again, as always, it's there. This one's got a little bit more JavaScript in it, all right, because or jQuery in it because of the work that's being done here. So as it says here, easing refers to the way an animation is performed. You get two of them by default, but there are plugins that you can use. And just so you see this, you don't have. This will be something that'll be more in chapters 10 and 11. Okay. But if I go out to jQuery, jQuery plugins, notice there's a registry. All right, plugins.jquery.com. And if you come in out, if you go in out there, I think you're going to find this is even more than what I saw. The last time I went through there were about 2,000. These are all free. All right. There are also plugins that you can make and submit to sites like this. There are plugins that you can buy that will do things. Now, I wouldn't expect you to go out and buy anything, but if you are creating a website for someone, it might be something that you want to look at or create yourselves. And it says here, I don't know what this is. I've never looked at this one. For a full list and demo of the easings in jQuery, it says you can go here. You know, again, sometimes with these sites, I have no idea how good this is or is not, but you can take a look at it. Notice you'll learn more about other plugins in Chapter 11. Remember, 8 and 9 this week, 10 and 11 next week. All right. So how to use the advanced animate syntax and other methods for working with cues. It's basically, for lack of better words, we're combining a lot of this stuff together. I wouldn't expect you to understand totally how to queue stuff, how to dequeue stuff, how to control how fast you're enqueuing or dequeuing something. All right. But they do explain it here and they show how it's used. All right. As it says here on the bottom, the special easing option lets you specify easings by property. You can also do it with a basic in the second example. And this is just one way you can do this. But again, this is a more advanced topic. All right. And this is the last thing that's in the chapter. Hint, hint, you might want to know how to do this for your test. But as it says, it's a carousel application that uses animation. And I don't know if you know this. I don't know if you'd even agree with what I'm about to tell you. But can you all see over here where I've got the mouse? Can you all see that? Can you see that greater than sign? That moves me forward a page. That moves me backward a page, right? That's a carousel. You're looking at this whole book. If you're looking at like now with a PDF, you don't have that typically. You know, you go up and down. But this is basically shown in a carousel format. Fortunately or unfortunately, the example they give kind of sucks. Because, you know, again, it's kind of a cheap little shill for buying their books. It's got pictures of their books, but it's fine in that it works, etc. All right. Now, I mentioned this to you yesterday, but I'm going to say it again. It is totally possible and plausible for you to go and create a carousel using only HTML and CSS. All right. It is totally possible and plausible for you to create a carousel using Bootstrap. That's pretty easy, really. You can just grab one off a Get Bootstrap site and modify it to your liking. All right. What we're talking about doing here is being able to create one using just JavaScript. When you are looking at your test, if you don't understand, can I do this, can I do that, then ask. And if the instructions that are written are general in nature, then you do it in a general way. In other words, you should be able to do it any way you want. If you're told to do something in a certain way, of course you should do it that way. So here's the HTML to set it up. All right. And they say they actually have more books in there, but they only showed some of them. This is the CSS, so notice what they're doing. How big is it? The overflow, so if there's something else there. So I think they have like a total of 6 images, but they only want to show 3 at a time. So notice overflow hidden means don't show the other ones. All right. They set up where they want it to be spaced. They set up how wide it should be, etc. And then they come back and they show you the jQuery. Now there's enough code here. But again, I've said this to you before. My recommendation is that you have your book open to this if you want to learn it, and you look at the text that's on the left-hand side and the code that's on the right-hand side and map them up. All right. And I think, yeah, I was going to say that's it. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Yeah, you're going to get a break, so don't worry about it. But I'm going to pause this. I'm going to pause the taping that I'm doing. I think I paused it. No, I didn't.